Hello and welcome to this Keynes Lecture. I'm Toke Eit and I'm the director of the Keynes Fund. Just in case some of you don't know, the Keynes Fund was established about 10 years ago by a generous donation to the university, and its purpose is to support research in economics and finance in the university. Now, I'm very pleased today to welcome Xavier Gabaix, who is here to give us the 5th Keynes Lecture. We will be filming this event, and we will be taking pictures of this event. So if you have any objections to that, now is the time to speak or forever hold your tongue.
Oh, thank you.
And if you want to object, speak to Marian about it. Right, so Xavier is the Pearson Square Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Harvard at the Economics Department. He has made major contributions to the understanding of finance and macroeconomics, in many cases using insights from behavioral economics, which are themes that are very close to the heart of the Keynes Fund. Now, many of you might be familiar with the important work that he has been doing over many years, but let me just mention a few things. I think the hallmark of his contributions is that they always truly break new ground and come up with what at least ex ante would be very surprising conclusions and opening up new doors of inquiry. Now, his work on the stock market volatility and tail events published in Nature is just one example of that, but perhaps the best example, the one that I know the best at least, is the inelastic markets hypothesis. It's sort of contrary to conventional wisdom, suggests that the inflows and outflows of funds in the stock market actually have a big effect on the prices. And that has really changed the way that many people are thinking about the interaction between finance and macroeconomics. Now, he has of course published his research in all the top journals, and he has also received a very long list of distinguished prizes over his career. Now, that includes the Fisher-Black Prize, given out every second year to the best financial economist under the age of 40, and numerous other prizes. So without further ado, I think I will hand over to Xavier to give us the lecture, which is going to be on economic networks, new models, facts, and identification methods. If anybody still have the mobile phone on, they might want to switch it off now, just in case. And finally, if anybody has a burning question while Xavier is speaking, he has agreed that he would take sort of clarifying questions. Otherwise, there will be some chance at the end of this to ask questions when you get to it. Okay.
Great. Thanks a lot, Toke. So actually, any question is fine. We have a very extensive notion of what clarifying is. If you think there's a major objection, clarification should be made. So it's a great pleasure to be here in Cambridge. So this is about the propagation of shocks in macro networks. And the goal, the main original contribution here is to have a way to think about causality or estimate in a causal manner what's going on in the macroeconomy. And we have a new approach. When I say new, it's with my friend Ralph Koijen, who's at Chicago, and we have something called granular instrumental variables. And we have also, this is online, and this is an ongoing paper, not yet online, with Ralph and Gabriel Chodor-Reich. And so for part of it is for undergraduates. So in macroeconomy, you know, often think, oh, the Fed does that, and this happens to that, or the banks do this, and this is what happens to investment. But we say that, but it turns out that to understand the extent of real causal linkages is really, really hard, because ideally you'd like some exogenous shock to the bank, and you see how it propagates. But often you don't have such exogenous shocks to the banking system as a whole. And so that's where the granular IV instrumental variables comes in. So what is a granular instrumental variable? So the names comes from an old now obsession of mine something that was written earlier on the granular origins of aggregate fluctuation. So the idea is in most economies, economic sectors, it's very concentrated, okay? So the share of the largest firms, the largest sectors in an economy are big enough so that their idiosyncratic shocks, so for the undergrads, idiosyncratic, it means a shock caused just inside the firm but not linked to anything, not primitively linked to anything in the economy. Think the CEO makes a bet on investing more, or on cutting costs or something like that, on betting a new technology, expose it could work or not work, so it will be a positive or negative productivity shock. So those idiosyncratic shocks are big enough because the firms are big enough or the sectors are big enough that they affect materially the aggregate. So it's useful to have just a few numbers to go away from the purely competitive model we have. So in Japan, the top 10 firms account for 30% of the exports. Okay? So if you understand shock to Sony, etc., potentially you understand what happens when there's a shock to Japanese exports. In Korea, the top two firms, just two firms, Samsung and Hyundai, it's also 35% of exports. And their sales, just those two firms, is 22% of Korean GDP. Okay? So economies are often very, very, very concentrated like that. In the US, the top 25 firms, it's 50% of the earnings and dividends. Okay? And so in general, shocks to Nokia, to Daewoo, this German bank, new sales to Boeing, those granular shocks are going to affect GDP. So why granular? What is this term? You could say normally in economics, you have a smooth shocks that affect everybody, but here you would have incompressible grains of economic volatility coming from idiosyncratic shocks to firms, and maybe driven by the CEO or the R&D or something like that. You might say, but still, why doesn't the economy diversify away? Because you have millions of firms in the economy. Well, if the variance is finite, typically it would if you have an economy with n firms, the volatility would go down of the aggregate GDP, like one of the quote of it. But when the firm size distribution is fat-tailed, basically you get a few very large firms. And then it diversifies much less and actually follows something called Zipf's law. I have a graph next, which is the actual distribution of firms. It decays not like 1 over square root of n, but 1 over log n. So it's much less diversified. Economies are naturally much less diversified than they would be in a naive manner. And itself, the Zipf's law is well understood, reasonably well understood from basically random growth processes. So just a few numbers for this aggregate view, granular fluctuations. So in that 2011 paper, say idiosyncratic shocks to large firms maybe explain 35% or so of aggregate fluctuations, both of GDP and of total factor productivity. There's been a number of studies with better data and updated methodology. So in France, maybe the top large firms explain maybe 40% of aggregate fluctuations. There's a very nice recent paper by Foster et al. In the JP, and they say that sector-specific shocks explain 75% of aggregate fluctuations of TFP. So TFP is not just one aggregate TFP movement throughout the economy, but you have very, very different movements in the construction sector versus the healthcare sector and the IT sectors, and those are very, very big. Those are very idiosyncratic and uncorrelated. What's exciting there is that potentially this kind of thing can revive, long-run growth analysis, because you don't have just one big shock in the economy, but lots of local shocks, and you can see how they propagate. And that's what we're going to explore today. There's a paper by Amity Weinstein, idiosyncratic bank supply shock also explain maybe 40% of fluctuations in the loan. Again, because banks are very, very concentrated. And in case, it's one of my oldest friends, the Zipf's law, just for the undergrads here. So here you plot the distribution of firm sizes in log, and the frequency also in log. And it falls on a nice straight line. And what's amazing is the R square is very high, so 0.99, which is pretty good in social science, okay? And there's no tautology saying it should be, something like that. And the exponent, meaning the slope, is 1.0, okay? Not 2.7, any random number. And across different countries, different economic systems, etc., it's very consistently very close to 1. That's called the Zipf's law, okay? And actually I have an early paper in 99 proposing an explanation for that. So that generates basically the random growth of firms, creates under some conditions this Zipf's law, which creates a very fat-tail distribution of firms, which creates also loss of concentration, which is what we're going to use. So granular fluctuations, large idiosyncratic shocks to firms, will affect the aggregate. And so what we're doing here in these granular instrumental variables is using that kind of fact of life. That's not just a fact, but there's a mechanism reasonably well understood behind that, random growth, to do identification in macro. Okay, and the idea, we'll have equations and everything, but the idea of a GIV, granular IV, is going to extract idiosyncratic shocks. So there's a whole issue of how do you convincingly to yourself, how do you convince yourself you have successfully extracted the idiosyncratic shock to Apple as opposed to some systematic shock, okay? Basically, we're going to run factor models and related notions. So once you have an idiosyncratic Apple shock, let's say Apple TFP shock, you can say, if Apple has a positive TFP shock, how does that affect, well, the aggregate wages in the US, aggregate investment in the US, aggregate the interest rate in the loan market, et cetera, et cetera. And what you're going to do is not just take Apple, but take lots of large firms, try to extract from the data their idiosyncratic shocks, say TFP shocks, you could have other type of shocks like demand for investment. And given those idiosyncratic shocks, see via a model, if there's an average big idiosyncratic shock for TFP, here's what happens to the dynamics of wages, or the dynamics of employment, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So that's the idea. And once you have this kind of granular view that this very lack of diversification is pervasive throughout the economy, then you can have a hope to find those granular instruments throughout, because you have idiosyncratic shocks everywhere with large firms or large sectors, and so that's what we're going to do. Okay, and before we go into the math, let's just imagine what happens. So you can answer questions like that, industry-wide spillovers, for instance. So suppose a firm expands, like Hilton decides to build more hotels in Cambridge. So will the other hotels in Cambridge say, oh, we need to also upgrade and improve, or we'll say we give up on the competition? So this way, with an idiosyncratic shock of investment to Hilton, you can look at the complementarity of investment in the hotel market. Okay, it would be if there's a positive idiosyncratic shock to Hilton, how does the competition react on average? And when we say Hilton, you look at many maybe hotel chains or industries in general to measure the reaction function of the other hotels to what their competitors do. Okay, and it's just another example, just one little example of how in general the economy or economic actors respond to shock in the economy. Likewise, financial sector doom loops. Suppose your banks do very poorly. What happens to the credit worthiness of a country? Okay, and so for how would you measure that? Well, you look at idiosyncratic bank shocks. Maybe Barclays had terrible returns in California. It's not a scoop, by the way. Just imagine. Okay, don't trade on that. So if Barclays had those terrible returns in California, you can see what's the impact of a fall in the assets of a UK banking sector on the credit worthiness of the UK government. Okay, and given that, you can say if there's a shock to the credit worthiness of the UK government, what's the impact on the other banks, for instance? So that would be the loop in the doom loop between banks and sovereign. Likewise, you could imagine growth spillovers. If there's a positive TFP shock by Apple, how does that maybe increase the TFP of other firms because they kind of imitate a la Romer, or maybe they give up because Apple is doing too well. So you can measure those things. So what I want to give you the sense of with that slide is that once you have those idiosyncratic shocks and that view, there ought to be a way to estimate all those things. And what I'm to propose is a hopefully fairly simple procedure to actually do that in practice with very precise instructions for the computer, so that the computer understands what we want it to do. Okay. Also, the GIVs, granular instrumental variables, they lower the need for finding unique one-off events. So typically, in like labor, if you have an instrument, you have some kind of unique historical knowledge. So this senator died and it was on this committee. As a result, the state of this senator received less money or something like that. Okay, but you really need to have this painstaking knowledge of history, or you have well-known shocks, but then they're just one-off. So there's a famous line of literature on the China shock. So it's when China entered the WTO, suddenly there was much more competition for lots of low-cost goods throughout the Western world, and what happened to workers, etc., etc. So this is great, but you have only one China shock. China entered the WTO only once. Okay. But now once you have a granular view, you can say, well, actually throughout the world, every month or every quarter, there are export productivity shocks by various countries all the time. And you could use the size-weighted sum of those idiosyncratic shocks as instruments available every month or every quarter or every year to do this kind of studies on a much more systematic basis. Okay? A very popular strategy in the past 10 years or so in macro has been these Bartik instruments. So Bartik instruments, I prefer not to say exactly what it is to take too much time, but the idea, so they're good to do the cross-sectional effects, but not at all for the aggregate effects. Okay? So they're good to answer, if California receives $1 more from the US government compared to another state like Oregon, how much will the GDP of California increase compared to the GDP of Oregon? Okay? But they're silent about if all states receive $1, what would happen? That's the full general equilibrium. Okay? Whereas GIV, in principle, you actually can do it. Okay? Okay, so let's get going with the actual technique. So the plan for today, we'll present first, we have two papers. One is this simple granular IV, basically like one little market, and there's already lots of things to understand there. And then we'll go to full networks. Okay, so we have much more complicated, much more general models with a networky flavor. How do you identify lots and lots of things in those models with kind of the same idea, but taken to the dimension n? So, okay, so plain JV. So first, this sounds like very boring, but it's very important, so pay attention to that. Notations. So we'll have n firms, so maybe n countries, depending on the example, with a relative size SI, and so the sum of the SI is 1. Okay? So if your firm is 5% of the market, SI is 0.05. And for a variable XI, we'll form two averages. One is XE, which is the equal weighted average, and the other one is XS, which is the size weighted average. Okay? And in the simplest version, the granular instrumental variable, gamma like granular, will be the size weighted minus equal weighted average, the difference between the two. Okay, and I'll explain why. Okay, so I love elementary economics. I think it's the best, is where everything, all the great ideas were produced, and also some of the original sins of economics were committed, like full rationality and all that. So it's good to revisit all those basic models, okay? And so here I go back to the 1920s for, what is econometrics anyway. In part, it's endogeneity in demand and supply, okay? So and then the granular IV will bring a new angle of attack on this whole problem. So here's a very simple of the oil market, if you want. Don't obsess about oil, just an example. So we have n countries and a succession of IID dates. And the demand for oil by country I is on average, so Y bar is just the total quantity of oil on average in the world. SI, that's the average share of country I. But this year, it's SI times 1 plus YIT, where YIT is the percentage difference from your usual consumption of oil. And let's say YIT will be, the top equation over here, depends on PT, the price of oil. It's really the normalized price. Okay, things log price compared to its average. With the elasticity of demand phi d, which we're really curious about. We want to estimate that, probably negative. And then there's a vector of common shocks eta t, and there's a vector of loadings lambda I on the vector of common shocks eta t. So that would be world business cycle type shocks in the eta t, and different countries could have different loadings. But now, very importantly, there's an idiosyncratic demand shock by, say, China, if I was China, for oil. Okay, depending on their policy, regulatory, and industrial, or whatever, there's an idiosyncratic demand shock for oil. So idiosyncratic, it means specific to country I and uncorrelated primitively with the rest of the world. Okay, so what's the aggregate demand for oil? Is the sum of the demands. So it's going to be y bar on average times 1 plus yst, and yst is this size-weighted average of yit. Okay, so it's the size-weighted average of the demand disturbance. The aggregate supply is modeled in this simple way. So it depends on the price with an inverse elasticity alpha. And we want to measure alpha, the elasticity of supply, or inverse elasticity of supply. Okay, so in equilibrium, supply equals demand. How does that happen? The price moves to make that happen. And so it means the price will follow that, and there's a supply shock epsilon t. The price will be the aggregate demand, but depends on the price, by the way, times alpha, this inverse elasticity of supply that we want to estimate, plus epsilon t is the supply shock. Okay? So it might be tempted if you're beginning undergraduate to maybe run an OLS, running the price on the quantity, and you can do that, but then you'll get a totally illegitimate estimate of alpha because the residual here, epsilon t, is correlated with the actual quantity via the equilibrium. Okay? So you can run it, but it's garbage. Okay? So we need an instrument to address the issue, and that's where the granular IV comes in. And so here the key assumption we're going to make, and in each application it needs to be discussed, is it valid or not? So is that you have run a good enough factor model so that the UIT shocks are truly idiosyncratic, okay? And in particular, they're uncorrelated, this perpendicular means uncorrelated, with eta t and the epsilon t, the shock to supply, okay? So that's the big assumption we make, okay? And basically, if it was not true, you could hope to just run an extra factor model that would absorb more and more variance, and hopefully you still get some idiosyncratic shocks at the end. Okay, so given that, what do we do? So here I just rewrote the demand disturbance by country I for oil, and I write down slowly the two averages I have in mind. So one is the size-weighted average, so I do the sum of those shocks times SI. The sum of the SIs is 1. And so when you look at it, so here I'm assuming all countries have the same elasticity of demand. That can be relaxed later, but here I want the simplest model where we can see what's going on. And also in the same spirit, I assume the loadings on the common shock eta t are just 1. Okay, so there's a one-dimensional eta t. Also easy to relax later, but I want the simplest model, okay, for now. Okay, great. So the size-weighted demand will depend on the elasticity of the price times the elasticity of demand, plus the common shock, plus the size-weighted sum of those idiosyncratic shocks that we'll call the size-weighted idiosyncratic shocks. And then I could also form the equal-weighted change in consumption of oil, which is we will weight 1 over n. Okay? And so you get the same term, price times elasticity plus common shock, plus the equal weighted sum of the idiosyncratic shocks. And then we have like the insight, why not, to construct the granular IV, the GIV, it's the first appearance, in the following manner. It's going to be, in that simple context, is just size-weighted sum of demand increases minus equal weighted. Okay? So then what's nice here is that inside the logic of a model, the price cancels out. The common shock also cancels out. Okay? And you're just left with size-weighted minus equal-weighted idiosyncratic shocks. And morally, you can imagine this equal-weighted is almost 0. It's not mathematically necessary, but it's useful for the interpretation. So morally, the Z is basically the size-weighted idiosyncratic shock. Okay? What was the demand shock for China for oil, plus the shock from Brazil, etc., etc. Okay, and so what happened so far? We constructed this GIV from observables. Okay, just made of look at the demand change for oil for each country. Okay? So it's made of observables, but inside the logic, the economic logic, it's just made of idiosyncratic shocks. And remember, we assume that each idiosyncratic shock is truly idiosyncratic, so uncorrelated with epsilon t, this aggregate supply shock. So we're in good shape to have some instrument. So let's look at that slowly because it's so important. I like to derive a few examples very slowly and hopefully clearly, and then one can imagine it generally as well and verify it also. Okay, so this is the supply, how the total supply changes. This is the price equation as a function of inverse elasticity of supply alpha, and this is the GIV made of idiosyncratic shocks. So for ZT to be a valid instrument, it needs to be exogenous and relevant. Exogenous, it means, so it's that equation. Given it's made of idiosyncratic shocks, it's uncorrelated with the aggregate supply shock. And it's also generically relevant. Okay, more on that later. So let's see visually that it's how it works. So given the supply equation, we have that. So at the correct alpha, price minus alpha times the quantity change should be equal to epsilon. And so this expected value of this product should be 0, because this is epsilon t and this is zt, and they're uncorrelated. So the expected value of the product should be 0. And so we can solve for alpha. Alpha is here. So what alpha? The elasticity of supply. It will be the covariance of zt of the instrument with the price divided by the covariance of instrument with the aggregate quantity. Okay? So we have an estimator of the elasticity of supply, and with finite amount of data, you would use the finite t equivalent of that. Okay? So this way with the GIV, we have an instrument that allows to estimate elasticity of supply. By the way, the same instrument, more on that very soon, is going to also able to estimate the elasticity of demand. Okay? So there's one instrument estimates both elasticity of supply and demand, which by the way seems superficially to contradict theorems from the undergraduate textbook, but there's no contradiction. Okay. Okay. So let's see. When does it work? Okay. So what's the precision of that estimator? So here's a simple proposition. It converges like 1 over square root of t, like always almost. And a good estimator should have a low standard error. So this is the standard error up to a square root of t parameter. And so to have a low standard error, I want what? I want a high Herfindahl and high idiosyncratic shocks. Okay? So for the precision to be high, the standard error to be low, I want a high Herfindahl. So it means basically a few large countries, at least one large country or large firms, or a few large firms in general. And I want big idiosyncratic shocks, high sigma u, okay, compared to the size of the aggregate shocks. And then I will have a good precision. And typically it's the case. Herfindahls are high, in part because of random growth that creates some Zipf's law-like phenomenon. So Pareto distribution of the very least and a few very large units. And also idiosyncratic shocks are very big compared to the aggregate. Okay? In part because the aggregate comes itself from idiosyncratic shocks, but that's so I think we can reasonably hope that in many contexts it's going to work. So now, this is just a very simple example. You may have a number of objections, or what about this, what about that. So let me show you a list. I won't go through everything of things we've discussed in the paper and with theorems, not just words. Okay, so what if you have time-varying size factors? It's really easy. You replace SI by SI at time t-1 or t-5 if you want. Okay? It works very simply with some extra technocratic condition. But okay, what if the shocks are heteroscedastic? You can totally handle that. I'll show that. Is that the best estimator? Yes. So it turns out that here I say V granular instrument, but really you have N granular instruments because you have N countries with each of them has their own idiosyncratic shocks. Okay? So it's great because you can have lots of other identifying restrictions because you have those N instruments. But the optimal GMM, if you want, combination of those instruments is exactly what I showed you, to do the size weighted minus equal weighted. okay, as a matter of theorem. So that's why we do that. But you could imagine taking just some part of the system. What if there's a very richer factor structure? So I'm going to talk about that. That's really important. So the biggest, weakest point of a GIV is maybe you didn't get the factor model correctly. So more on that very soon. And what about lots of other things? And what about, what's the link with in a narrative historical account? And I'm going to talk about that. So, and I'm going to also talk about threats to identification and robustness to what if you have a misspecified model. Okay, so that's where we're going. Then I'll show you an empirical example, and then we'll go to networks with GIV. Great. So, so the above, let me just mention that. The above combination to do size minus equal weighted is the optimal thing to do. And if you have heteroscedasticity, you want to do not equal weighted but inverse variance weighted, which we call pseudo equal weighted. Okay, so you inverse variance as opposed to 1/n, but it's more or less the same thing. Okay. Now the biggest, again, like I said, the biggest Achilles heel. There's many heels, but the biggest one is that you may have a wrong factor model. So if you remember, the demand of country I is this elasticity of demand. So if I remove the equal weighted, is going to be there will be a residual, which is the factor model basically. So let me make it slightly more explicit. There could be R factors, and there could be country I has a loading lambda I f for factor f, and the shock will be times the aggregate value of the factor f. Again, factor f might be, factor 1 might be some GDP world shock, factor 2 might be some interest rate world shock, and other things like that. Okay? And then there's this residual UIT, and forget the little check. It's a technical difference because I removed the mean. Okay, so we assume that the UIs were orthogonal to the epsilon t. So how do you handle that? Basically, you just run a factor model. So what's a factor model? It's a very, very well understood old econometric technologies from the, I don't know, 50s or so. And you can ask the computer, tell me what's the optimal amount of factors I would have. Is it 2 factors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 factors? And given I postulate this shape, the computer will return what are the lambda i's, what are the eta t's, okay? And what are the residuals. So basically, you run you demean. Okay, you need to control for the price. So here you just demean. You could have fancier things otherwise. You run a factor model, and and then you get the idiosyncratic shocks UIs, and that's what you use to form your GIV, and you form the size minus equal weighted sum of those UIs. Okay, so that's the more systematic procedure. Okay, and so it's useful to know, do we really have a factor model? So there's a number of tests you can propose. We propose. But the simplest procedure in practice is you imagine, okay, I run a factor model with 2 factors. When you go from 0 factors to 1 factor, you always want to have 1 factor at least. And once you go from 1 factor to 2 factors, it changes a bit the estimate, typically. And once you go to 3, 4, 5 factors, the estimate is very stable. So you're kind of done, basically. Okay? Okay, so now let's go back to supply and demand, just to finish that. So we have this elasticity of demand, and we could also, if we inverse the system, say there's this supply elasticity. The aggregate supply depends with this elasticity of supply. In equilibrium, supply equals demand. Okay, so you have those kind of equations. So you could estimate things with OLS. Okay, and basically you would, just as a matter of fact, the size-weighted idiosyncratic shock will affect the aggregate quantity by this multiplier M, which is this mixture of elasticities of supply and demand. And the size-weighted idiosyncratic demand shock will affect the aggregate price via this other mixture of supply and demand elasticities. Okay? So basically, you can run, as a theorem, you can run the aggregate quantity on the GIV, and you get this first multiplier, and you can regress the price on the GIV, get this other mixture of elasticities. You have 2 parameters estimated by OLS, so it's really simple. And from them, you can you have those two moments depending on two elasticities. You can back out the elasticities. Okay, or you can proceed like labor people like to do with first stage, second stage. And so you would say, what's the first stage? So I form my GIV, size minus equal weighted, and I regress the price on the GIV, maybe controlling for other things too, okay? You get a coefficient that inside the logic of a model, you know what it is, but you don't necessarily need to care at this stage. And then you define this is the how the shock to Z affects the price. So this is the price instrumented by the GIV. And then you just regress by OLS the aggregate supply on the price instrumented by the GIV. And this is a consistent estimator of the elasticity of supply. And you regress the actually equal weighted growth rate of demand or absorption consumption on the price instrumented by the GIV, and you get also a consistent estimate of the elasticity of demand. So that's why I said with this one GIV estimator, you can estimate both elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. Okay? So it's really simple and elementary. So I invite you, if you're skeptic, and maybe skeptic, you can work through the basic first 5 pages of a paper, just to make everything very clear, and it's all very, okay? And then once one can do that, then one can imagine much more complicated variants, more on that soon. So now you might see it's still a bit black boxy, okay? So something that's useful to do is a narrative check. So you can do that, for instance, when you have daily data or lots of high quality data. And in one of our applications, we do that. So basically, you would say, let's look at the top event by size times how big the idiosyncratic shocks were, okay? And we look at them one by one. So you say, okay, imagine this is the oil market. Okay, this date is Saddam Hussein investing in Kuwait. That is a true negative supply shock. This other year is OPEC decided to do something. That's also kind of a true idiosyncratic supply shock, okay? And maybe some events you can argue, maybe you drop the event. So you could form a GIV just based on maybe the top 15 shocks that passed your narrative check, where you say, I'm really reasonably confident they are idiosyncratic, okay? And this is still a valid instrument. So the optimal thing for the GIV is to add all the idiosyncratic shocks, okay, size weighted. But it's okay if you remove just half of them, because the remaining ones are just also a valid instrument, okay? And so this way, the GIV it kind of adds to the traditional narrative approach because it tells you, it gives you lots of candidate instruments for here's a banking shock where suddenly the idiosyncratic shocks to Barclays where their assets fell enormously in value. You can see what was going on. Was it truly idiosyncratic? Maybe some badly calculated bets. And also the GIV removes the common factors, so you get a purified instrument that you couldn't get with a purely narrative approach. Okay, so it kind of adds also just the historian almost, basically. Okay, so when is it robust? When is it not? So let me start optimistic to showing when it's robust, and then I'll show what the weakest points for the robustness. So suppose you keep some of the shocks but not the others. You still get an unbiased estimate, okay? So it's still totally valid. You could just look at the GIV for the top, based on the top 5 firms as opposed to all the firms, provided you size weight. It's a totally legitimate instrument, just slightly less efficient. If you assume homogeneous elasticities, but they're actually different, then, well, if you control for the common factors well, then you're fine. Just the elasticity you report is the equal weighted average as opposed to some other average. If you may specify the size, maybe instead of the size at time t minus 1, you take the size at time t minus 5 or something, or you don't have not quite the right concept of size, not a problem. It's still, when you do IV, it's still a totally valid instrument. It's not the most efficient instrument with slightly wrong sizes, but it's still a valid instrument. If you did OLS, it would be somewhat biased. So the biggest threat to identification, like I announced, is that you didn't control well for the common factors. So we form ZT size minus equal weighted. minus the factor model you extracted, it will be the idiosyncratic shock plus the actual impact of the common factors minus your estimated impact of the common factors. So there could be a discrepancy between the two, and that's to my mind, the biggest potential weakness. Fortunately, there are lots of solutions, or at least ways to approach that. One is you can do over-identification tests, look at what about shocks from some subset of the countries, that's one instrument, another subset of the countries, that's another instrument, and hopefully they give you the same answer. You could test over a number of factors, you could do a narrative check. If there are periods that are too weird, like COVID or something, you could just remove those sporadic factors, remove those periods from the sample, and that's also valid. So those are like 4 ways to get more exact identification. So at the end, what does, if we give a user's guide, how would you do it in this context? So you have YIT or demand shock depends on this price times the demand elasticity plus some factors plus UI plus some maybe controls. And the price depends on the aggregate demand shock with the elasticity you want to have plus some controls and some aggregate factor. So first you run a little panel regression with time fixed effect and a country fixed effect. Okay, so you get your and low control, you get a residual. Then on those residuals, you run, if you have candidate loadings like log size, parametric loading, log size, and the like, you run the factor model with those parametric loadings. And then you get the residual, and you can run a non-parametric model called principal component analysis. It's a very well understood statistical technique. And then you collect the common shocks and mostly the idiosyncratic shocks. Okay? And then you can do 2 things. You can do OLS, you can do IV. So if you do OLS, you regress, say, aggregate quantity of the price on the GIV and controlling for the rest. And then you're going to get the estimate of this multiplier. And you regress the price on the GIV, you get an estimate of this other kind of multiplier. Okay? So really kind of simple procedure once you get the logic. Or you can do an instrumental variables approach, and so you regress the price on the GIV, and instrumenting, for the price here, you instrument the quantity by the GIV, and to estimate the elasticity of demand, you estimate, you instrument the price by the GIV. Okay? So it's really kind of labor type techniques, hopefully kind of routinized. Okay? So let me show you one empirical application kind of quickly, because to do it real, it's a whole paper. Actually, I gave this paper during COVID at the macro seminar here. So a little bit of, so really, I'm very interested in those, identification issues, but I remain a committed economist. And so it started with a project that now called In Search of the Origins of Financial Fluctuations, the inelastic markets hypothesis that actually Tucker was very nicely talking about. So some years ago, Ralph Kogen and I were thinking about what moves the market. It was like a perennial question in economics, and as part of my behavior point nature, the traditional answer in macro models is basically the consumption CAPM. It's all change in the covariance with marginal utility and the like. It just looks completely ridiculous to me always. But then you need a model to beat a model, and so what do you replace it with? And so we're thinking maybe it's, flows. It looks like flows in the stock market affect price movements. That must be true, but maybe in an important way that's kind of behavioral, okay? And something in currency markets and the like. So, but then we had a nice thought experiment, which was, it started really as a thought experiment. Suppose the typical investor, as a stylization of the market, allocates maybe 80% of its portfolio in equities, 20% in bonds, in value, and kind of tries to stay with that kind of target, okay? Then, to derive it well, it's a whole paper, okay? But the elasticity of demand for stocks compared to bonds will be 0.2, which is this 20% over here. Okay, fine. Which means then that inside the logic of a model, if, say, Vasco here buys $1 worth of stocks selling bonds, okay, it's going to mechanically increase the valuation of all equities, total valuation of the aggregate market by $5. So another way to symmetric business buys and sells. So if Vasco was to buy 1% of the market, it would make the aggregate market go up by 5%. Okay, so it's a really big impact of flows into prices. Okay, and if that's true, then you have a vista to think about the fluctuation of the market. Those flows, and there's just a small side effect that's a bit unimportant. It may be very central to the dynamics of excess fluctuations in stock markets, currency markets, and the like. Okay, and so we had the thought experiment before seeing any data, but we wondered, how do we estimate that? So how do you estimate this kind of thing? And that's how we came up, basically, after 1.5 years of banging our heads against the walls, with the idea of a granular IV. So I just show you a few numbers without going too much in detail of how we do that. So we have disaggregated, we have two types of empirical works, but we have disaggregated segments of the aggregate market from different types of investors, from the flow of funds. And you can model, okay, the change, I'm a type of institution number I, or institution number I, this is the change in my demand or my holdings of equity as a fraction of the equity market. It depends on what happened to the price, or the price dividend ratio of equities, with some elastic zeta, what we want to estimate. And maybe there will be some shocks to my demand that depend on aggregate shocks, like the Fed, the macroeconomy, whatnot, and idiosyncratic shocks. And you can think about them as fund managers as idiosyncratic bets that's optimistic about shocks or pessimistic about shocks, or some investments sector has this kind of view. Okay? And so what we do in the empirical analysis in that paper is we run this kind of factor model, we extract the idiosyncratic shocks, and then we assume that the factor model is good enough that they're uncorrelated with the aggregate factor. And then, as a matter of economic logic, it should be the case that the size-weighted sum of those idiosyncratic shocks in the same quarter will affect the price with a multiplier m, which is this 1 over elasticity. So if the elasticity is indeed 0.2, the multiplier should be 5. Okay? And so that's what we do. Oops. And so we have two types of analysis, one with the flow of funds and one with Morningstar, lots of funds, and there are lots of data from something called the 13F data. Anyway, all the details I lovingly explain in this paper. Let me just show you a little bit GIV in action. So here we regress. In the same quarter, we have 104 quarters, so 26 years of data. You regress in the same quarter, the change in the price, really the return on the S&P stock market index on this Z, the size-weighted sum of those measured idiosyncratic shocks. And the slope should be this multiplier. If there's 1% idiosyncratic shocks into the market, buying the market, what happens to the price? And so here you find controlling for, say, aggregate GDP growth and then one principal component, a multiplier of 7. And if you add one more principal component, you find a multiplier of around 5. Okay? So 1% inflow in the market increases prices by 5%, symmetric between buys and sells. Okay? And then you can look at lots of other things. You could ask, is it a temporary blip that immediately mean reverts, or is it permanent? So first, on a priori ground, the stock market is very hard to forecast. It's kind of a random walk, okay? So on a priori ground, it could not mean revert very fast. It's just that would be kind of contradicting lots of things we know about the stock market. When you actually look at the data, this is confirmed. So the way you read this, there's an idiosyncratic shock at time 0, okay? You see how the stock market reacts, boom, you see it goes up with this multiplier of 7, okay? And then the price subsequently basically is consistent with flat around the walk, okay? So we say it's a permanent impact. In the calibration of the model, those shocks, they mean revert at a half-life of 10 years or so. So maybe as people retire and things like that, or long-run business cycles. So things are not literally permanent, but a half-life of 10 years or 7 years or something like that, consistent with a half-life of price-dividend ratios and similar price multiples. Okay, and so we're we're excited by this inelastic markets hypothesis, and the idea we're industriously trying to write a version of macrofinance that's I can believe, and I think Ralph can believe, not with replacing these Euler equations, but at the center of macro and finance, for better or for worse, I think really for worse. And you will replace the Euler equation by flows in elasticity, and you need also a behavioral investor, so that's part of my love for behavioral things. And it gives empirical guidance. We get empirical guidance from various assets, and you can explore the link between prices, macro variable expectations, and form a coherent alternative to this kind of a consumption cabin. So stay tuned. This paper, Inelastic Market, is almost finished, which means only 1.5 years of revisions. But we're working on other things, including currencies and bonds and the link with the real economy. So now, going back to the network now, GAV. So let's say we have analyzed how to estimate an elasticity for one little market. Okay, so can we generalize and do all of macro? May as well, and big. And so that's a project with Ralph and with Gabe Schroeder-Reich, who's a great empirical macroeconomist, my colleague. So the idea is we think it's going to be useful both for macro, if you're not macro, for like international finance, international economics, and also general economics, the social networks and transmissions and fads and things like that. Okay, so stay tuned even if you're not a macro person. So here's the basic setup. Okay, so it's going to be a little dry, and then I'll show 3 types of economic situations that map into that. Okay, but we started with spatial models, and then realized that it was actually much better to reason at a high level of generality, because you see the essence of things. And so it will look kind of dry and abstract, but actually we found it's a very useful way to address many issues in one go. Okay, so what it is. There's a YT, a vector of outcomes at MT. Okay, so things could be the growth rate of n firms, or it could be the growth rate of n firms and the change in all their n prices, for instance. Okay, or it could be how health status of some people or something like that. Okay, and now this depends. What firm I does depends on what all the other firms J do via this matrix B. So you want to have some structural or semi-structural model what this matrix of contagion, if you want, is. So in the simplest macro models with some cousin of the input-output matrix. Okay, but it's going to be fancier depending on the model. And then it depends on some parameters named gamma. Okay, so it's a vector of parameters that we would like to identify. And then there will be idiosyncratic shocks, so UIs that might be TFP shocks by the firm, or the demand shocks by the firm, and with some chi that's for our purpose is not important, and some aggregate shock eta t, a vector of aggregate shock with some loadings lambda. Okay, so this is pretty general looking. Equivalently, when you solve for the YT, you get YT depends on the UT times the matrix A. That's this kind of aggregate of the B matrix. Okay. So we want to estimate the vector gamma. Let's find let's talk about 3 concrete examples just to see what this. So it's more concrete. So the simplest network model would be that, I suppose. So you get. Here's how firm I maybe invest or whatever. It's productivity. Let's say productivity. It's TFP or TFP innovation. It depends on the TFP of the other firms J times some network loading Gij that we assume we know, but with a strength gamma that we do not know. Okay? We don't know what the strength is. Will the firms I imitate the firms J, or maybe give up? They cut on R&D expenditure because they give up. Firm J is too good. That would be a negative gamma, and what's the strength of that? Okay? And if you think about Romer or Hagion-Howitt style propagation of growth, at some level, those things have a shape a little like that. And the big question is how big are those externalities between the firm J and firm I's, and is captured by this gamma. That would be nice to estimate. Okay? And so if you say that the big YT is the vector of aggregate all, collects together all these little YITs, so it will be the matrix B times Y, and the matrix B times Y is just the G matrix times this gamma. There's just one-dimensional parameter gamma to estimate. Okay? And if you're a big firm, a big influencer J, you would have a big GIJ. So if you want to say, I don't know, if you're into Twitter, which I'm not, but if you're into Twitter, it will say, oh, who is a big influencer? Their GIJ might be like the number of followers, or whatever they're called, okay? And GIJ are you following, for instance, okay? And you can see how fads propagate, for instance, okay? And it will be, again, before I want to do too much, overwhelm you too much with math. The stories are a bit easier to remember. It will be if somebody on Twitter, quote unquote, had a big position for or against some issue, how does that influence everybody else? So to look at this gamma parameter, you look at the biggest influencers, their biggest idiosyncratic position for or against something, okay? And you see how it influences everybody. And part of the art will be to aggregate together, like optimally, all those idiosyncratic shocks to get an optimal estimator of gamma, or at least some estimator of that influence parameter gamma. Okay? Great. An economic version would be TFP, for instance. If YIT, a la Romer or so, is influenced by YJT, and the GIJ may be there, how much they trade with each other. Okay? You typically want to have a more specified model of that, and then you're in business. Okay, so that's one example. Another model would be the supply and demand. So let's verify if we're general enough, we should also capture supply and demand. Otherwise, we're clearly not general enough. So this is a bit the model we had before, but I enrich it by the quantity demanded by firm I will depend on the price with some elasticity of demand that depends on I. Okay? And some aggregate shock and some idiosyncratic shock, and the price depends on the aggregate demand, so size-weighted sum of demands with some elasticity of supply psi, or inverse elasticity of supply psi. So then the big YT vector will be the vector of all the quantities demanded or consumed in equilibrium and the little price. Okay? And it will depend, this YT depends on YT on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side, sorry, with this matrix B that has in its guts elasticity of supply, elasticity of demand. And so the vector gamma would be two-dimensional. Sorry, if elasticity of demand were the same, two-dimensional, elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply. If they're not the same, it could be n plus one dimensional. Okay? And you see, a priori, it looks very complicated. If there's an idiosyncratic shock to that firm, how does that affect the price, which affects all the other firms? And then to extract the idiosyncratic shock, you need to know their own demand. So there's like a big loop, but precisely we're going to handle that thanks to math. We have a simple way to handle that in a compact and systematic way. Okay? So another is we developed in this paper, still not online, maybe hopefully around September online, a new model of dynamic macro model. What do we need in a new model? So the classic model like Long-Plosser and Vasco's model with Daron and company, everything is Cobb-Douglas. That's okay. Always easier if everything is Cobb-Douglas. We have sometimes you can do a more, different away from Cobb-Douglas, but you need some specific assumption like a common aggregate goods and all that. But so in this paper, we write a kind of new model a la Long-Plosser in that tradition, that's much more flexible to be able to handle more general economies, so firm I uses inputs from all the other firms J with also labor and capital and the utility function, okay? But they need not have common elasticity of 1, that would be Cobb Douglas, or common elasticity at all. So different goods could have different elasticities. Like the demand for oil is surely less elastic than the demand for fruit. I don't want to make it up, but it must be true. And so you want to allow that. I mean, we want to allow that. Okay? And we have also international economics extension of that kind of analytics. So when you do it, which takes 10 pages of derivation, you get the following shape, which is here P hat is the vector of prices for all the N firms or N industries. Y hat is the vector of quantities actually in value for the N industries. And P hat will depend on your productivity shock Z, productivity shock here called U, like supply shock. And the aggregate quantities that this inverse this matrix, so we have this matrix, inverse supply elasticity matrix. Okay, so like a big matrix basically that has the input, the Leontief input-output matrix in it, and modulated by the various elasticities. Okay? And likewise, the aggregate demand for each sector will depend on the aggregate price times this elasticity of demand. Okay? And that itself depends on the underlying elasticity of demand and actually the transpose of the Leontief matrix. Anyway, so it has the right shape, meaning if the big YT will be vector of prices across the N firms, a vector of quantities across the N firms. It depends on itself, so to speak, meaning on the other firms, times this matrix B, that depends very non-linearly on gamma via these elasticities of supply and demand. And so that's what we want to estimate. You can also write the same thing in differences, maybe with also some extra stickiness, because things take time to go through the network typically, as opposed to one shot. And so you would get almost the same equations. Now the vector of price inflation, so really the vector of price changes, depend in form I depends on the other vectors times the matrix, plus all these other, plus how the quantities change and maybe lagged changes in prices, and likewise here. So it has the same shape basically with changes in prices, changes in quantities, and it has this kind of nice looking shape now with also T-1. Okay? So that's the kind of, so we can estimate, at least in principle as a matter of theorems, all those kinds of models. So how do we do it? Let me give you just a little bit of the idea, okay? And, but I want to overwhelm you with some math. Again, the idea will be we're going to somehow extract idiosyncratic shocks. Once we have idiosyncratic shocks, we'll say, if there's a shock to unit I, how does it affect everything else in the network? Okay? And then we're going to do it putting together for each shock by unit I, how it affects all the units J, and putting together all those experiments in one, hopefully sensibly aggregated moment. Okay? So I give you a bit the flavor of that, just so you see the intuition. So suppose there are no aggregate shocks, and suppose we know gamma, so there will be a loop. Suppose we know gamma, then we can extract the idiosyncratic shocks. And then, given the idiosyncratic shocks, we'll be able to estimate gamma, and then we'll loop. That's kind of what it is. So if we know the shock, idiosyncratic shock to all the firms except firm I, okay? So let's call Y given minus I. This is the impact on the aggregate vector of the shocks of all the firms except firm I. So here, remove the shock to firm I. Okay? And I look at how it affects actually firm I. Okay? And so firm I is affected by the shocks to all the other firms, okay, that circulate through the network, times, here this is just the indicator function for component number I, times the network's matrix with the parameter gamma, plus something that's linear in UI. Okay? So what would be tempting to do, I give the intuition, is maybe let's just do OLS. So if I knew indeed those shocks, this is the change in all the firm's actions due to their own idiosyncratic shocks, okay? I could regress how does firm I react to that, and I optimize above this nonlinear vector, above this, on this vector gamma. And so I will get this term times B gamma. This is the derivative of a matrix B with respect to the parameter gamma. It could be a vector parameter gamma, okay? And basically, this expresses, let's optimize how firm I responds to the shocks to all the other firms but firm I. Okay? And what we do is, so this is a valid moment. You can put all those moments together. It turns out the way we do it here is optimal. And you have one nice GMM moment aggregating all those shocks together. And that's what we propose. To do. We have identification results, and you don't want to. Well, let's not go into there. Let me just close the loop on the first network I started with, which is this kind of social network where firm I responds to firm J's with that network Gij, and with the influence intensity gamma. Okay. So how do we? What's the precision of that? Anyway, there's a bunch of math here, but the key message is the following. In the plain GIV that we had with one model, the variance, the standard error decreased like 1/square of t, like in normal econometrics. But here the standard error decreased in 1/square of n times t. Okay? Which means that even if you have a fairly small time series, now if you have a very big cross-section of firms, n, then you get much more variation. And intuitively, it means you don't have just one idiosyncratic shock and you see how it affects. You have that t times because you have t periods, but you have also t times n times because if one given period, you have n almost independent sub-industries that affect each other. And they're not really independent, but precisely the math comforts you that it's as if is the n times t that really matters. And you see our friends, the squared Hoffindahl, that's also there. Okay, so you want to have a big Hoffindahl and a big number of industries and a big t. Or it could be, these days in big data, we have a lot of data sets with a fairly short, at least for now, time depth, because it's kind of all recent, okay, maybe 5 years, 8 years, okay? But many, very large cross-section of firms, okay? So that would be very useful. I mean, that is a great place to do potentially a network GIV, okay? Because of this kind of result. Anyway, so we do that. It turns out under some conditions, it's almost the same thing as the maximum likelihood estimator, but it's much more interpretable. And you can say, let me select just some of the shocks to some industry, not the others, etc. So it's much more under control. You can also have, an arbitrary number of lags, and it's kind of the same idea. Okay, so it's a very general structure. So my hope is that one can do a lot of macro. So it's more for the grad students here. I think there was a big problem in how to do identification in macro. Okay, it's a big criticism from outside of macro. But with this granular IV and with this like network GIV, you can do almost like VARs, but with some economic structure behind that, and with identification. Okay, and maybe people will say, I don't believe your identification, but you have so many other identification restrictions. Say, look, if the identification comes from that industry or that industry or that industry, hopefully it's fairly similar. If it's not similar, there may be something wrong maybe in your model. Maybe they have different elasticities of supply or whatever, okay? Great, so that's why I'm excited by that. So let me finish with just some ideas of how those things might be used. In principle, one can estimate lots of parameters in macro models with that network GIV. So I've talked about if Apple has a productivity shock, how does that impact suppliers or producers, maybe quantities and prices and productivity and wages, etc. Okay, and not just Apple, but all the firms. How does inflation propagated network? There's some really interesting work on that. Typically using one type of shock, say oil shock. Okay, but now you can use lots of shocks because you have lots of shocks for lots of goods. Okay, there's the missing intercept for Bartik that's more inside, but it's how do you do full general equilibrium? So in principle, you can do that with this kind of model. There's also payoffs in international macro. So you can answer, in principle, if China has a positive TFP shock or demand shock, how does that kind of propagate for the rest of the world economy? Okay, impact of GDP, exchange rate, inflation. So I don't recommend doing just purely mechanical models with no thinking. It turns out that, for instance, in these models is known by insiders, but not everybody. The supply shock, they propagate like the input-output matrix. But the demand shocks, they propagate like the transpose of the input-output matrix. Okay? So you don't put any random network model. You want to have some economic thinking about which one matters. Or you could put both and ask the data to distinguish which weight on the transpose versus on the initial input-output matrix. So it need not be completely structural. I find it useful to have a structural model in mind to understand things. You could imagine doing regional macro. If there's one region has a techno hub, how does that affect the other regions, positively, negatively, how much, when, etc. So that's potentially lots to do. In finance, if markets are inelastic, there's a meaningful, very, very finite elasticities of demand. You can estimate them. Why would you do that? In part to understand how, if there's a flow into the dollar, how much does the dollar appreciate, or the flow out of the pound, or how does the pound depreciate. You can then imagine doing optimal policy. So if you have a central bank and you have a limited amount of assets, you have, say, $100 billion of pounds worth of assets to buy, what's the best way to stimulate the economy? Is it by buying stocks or bonds or junk bonds, etc.? So you use those elasticities and cross elasticities, and then the impact on the real economy to see the optimal or the maximum impact you can have. You can potentially use idiosyncratic shocks to investment from country I to country J to think about what's the impact on the exchange rate and also the interest rate, and see how savings responds, and maybe think about the elasticity of savings and investment. Again, there are lots of things I think that could be estimated this way. Okay, perhaps in 5 years you will tell me, Xavier, you were way too enthusiastic. It actually doesn't apply so easily, but for now I'm actually very optimistic. Okay, and let me. You could have non-trivial factors, but let me not go there. And you can use the GIV to do much more. Actually, it's a fun. We had lots of fun conversation with Ralph saying, how would you estimate this and that? And almost always there was, at least in principle, a GIV answer. So a recent paper I like a lot is Kamanovo-Ray, and they say, if there's a foreign inflow by mutual funds into this or that stock market, what happens, foreign country, what happens to the exchange rate? And this way you have at least some estimate of the impact of the flow, use idiosyncratic flows by some mutual funds of the mutual fund sector into Brazil. You can see how much does the Brazilian real appreciate, and you can, it's really interesting stuff, and you can speculate about why it reacts a lot in some sectors, less in others. Suppose there's an idiosyncratic demand shock by some hedge fund for the Turkish lira. What happens to the Turkish lira, but also what happens to Turkish wages and exports and imports, and maybe the dynamics of that. If there's an increase in concentration, you could imagine a GIV approach for that. There's an increase in TFP for the top employer. It increases. What's the impact on wages and employment, etc. So there are lots of things one can do. Anyway, conclusion. The GIV, at the end, it's a really simple idea. Okay, you have those idiosyncratic shocks. They matter. So if you somehow manage to extract them, and you can see how they affect prices and quantities over time for the economy. So there are lots of impulse responses that they trace potentially. The key thing is how do you extract them? Okay, but it must be, maybe what we're doing is not the optimal thing to do, but there must be a way to do it. And this is our best attempt, but maybe some of you will have ideas of how to make it more perfect or less imperfect. It allows us to estimate things. Have a fairly systematic construction of instruments, and you can do disaggregated models, sectoral models, international macro, and then establish causality, and then maybe understand better all those causal links in macro. So I think there's lots of good things to do in empirical and theoretical macro. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for this excellent lecture. So if there's any questions, we have a bit of time to have a discussion. We don't have a microphone we have a microphone, but they don't have a microphone I can take around in the room. So if anybody would want to ask a question, they need to speak up so we can hear them. Good, so Do we have any takers? Okay, so, Vasco, would you?
Thank you very much. So just two quick questions, and if they get too nerdy, we can just talk offline. On the network part, we can talk through it, but I assume like this. So let's take the following case. I have a production network that I do London Blossom. So you can show that in certain cases, depending on the network topology, if I regress if the model has no common factor, and I regress a little version of what you said, so kind of the vector of whatever sector of firm growth rates on the vector of firm growth rate yesterday. So if that model is generating the data, but there is no common shock, so it's
right.
an extreme version of Gabaix. Right? The world is entirely granular, there's no aggregate shocks.
Okay.
The econometrician will find there's a factor for you.
Right.
Because there's enough cross-sectional dependence done by the propagation, so the fact that we now all co-move, and the econometrician is approaching the data, if it's just kind of, let me clean out for the common shocks by cleaning out common variation in factors, is in fact picking up what you want to get, which is the propagation of shocks.
Right.
There's a little example of that, not in the fourth Sarton Watson paper you quoted, but the 2010 version of that research is there. So I wonder if you've thought about that. And the second is, this seems a lot like there's a very large literature on Mansky, Durloff, social interactions, and there's a version of that literature with social interactions on networks. That's where it evolves partly. And there's quite a bit of econometric work, so I wonder if there's any relation to the econometric work of people trying to kind of tease out these social factors.
Great. Okay, fantastic question. So this is a very advanced question by people experts in the. Okay. So the idea is just let me rephrase Vasco's first question first. Is if suppose they are truly just idiosyncratic shocks, okay, but in a model like Lagrange-Plosser and others, including Vasco's model with Darren Semoglu and co-authors. It will look like there's some one-factor structure of the economy, at least to a first-order approximation. But truly, that factor is only made of idiosyncratic shocks. So it turns out this kind of structure might exactly capture that. So it would be, it's not directly, my matrices are a little opaque here, but it would be exactly one of the components here would have size-weighted sum of what the other firms are doing. So it will be picked up that way. But in general, it's a really big concern, actually. That's a great question. So in the plain GIV, we have an online appendix. One of the online appendices discussing this issue. But the really good way to do it would be to use directly model the issue. So the short answer is yes. First, it's a great concern. It's an important concern, and it's a great question, and I think we can really handle that and measure exactly how much is truly like exogenous shocks, like the Fed has some random shock in their mind, as opposed to reaction to aggregate development in various sectors of the economy. Great. And about Mansky and company, so we talked to a number of experts in this kind of social networks literature. So this is to estimate a little bit models like that, and they can be jazzed up. And typically, they don't at all use this kind of granular IV. They use more, have exogenous characteristics of the various players in the network, and I see or some exogenous shocks to them that identified from like knowledge or some historical accident or something like that, and you see how they impact. So we're going to, and now we're slowly getting up to speed in that literature, and what we are sure is that a lot of what we do is completely new to that literature, but we don't know exactly the extent of the intersection, which must be non-zero. Yeah. Yes?
Narendra, if I could ask a rather general question, since you had a very precise question. So I'm assuming working with these granular variables must be computationally much harder than working with, say, aggregate variables and so on. Is that true?
It's true, but it's the computer who does the work. So it's not a problem. So instead of n equals 2, you have n equals 2000, and the computer doesn't mind at all. That's the charm of, yeah.
But to make it powerful, you need a very large n, I assume.
You need, not necessarily, so in the stock market application I showed you, n was like 14 or something like that. It's actually, to my taste, it's much better if it would be better if it was larger, but it's okay. You could imagine doing a, really interesting network economics within Europe or something, so I'm not sure. Because of Brexit, there's fewer countries, but n is order of magnitude 20, and you can do lots of good, fun things with 20. But once you've instructed the computer to do things with n equals 20, the computer really doesn't mind to do 200, maybe a few years later, but as Moore's law works.
Is very hard, right?
Sorry?
200 by 200 matrix is very hard to work with.
Right, so that's part of why our research assistants are not going as fast. They're fantastic, but they're not going as fast as possible. They tell me we need to use tricks somehow. So I'm not completely on top of those things. But my, Moore's law will work, even if it takes a bit more time. Moore's law is working for us. So I think the computational part will be the really easy part. The difficulty is data and reliable models and sensible sources of identification. So the computation will be easy.
Right, but just to clarify what my question is, what I actually meant to ask was, do you see potential for applying some of the more recent advances in data science to this kind of
right?
that you're using?
Yeah.
For example, machine learning.
Right, I think that would be cool. Like many of us, I'm slowly getting up to speed or trying to get up to speed fast on machine learning. Here I try to keep things very like quadratic, just there's enough going on. Though the B matrix is non-linear, but and yeah, I think that would be. I think in terms of the scarce resources in intellectual economics is having good ideas for new models, good data on micro level things and banking, consumers, credit cards and whatnot, and then sensible identification strategies. But the computational part is the easy bit. But okay, I'm not doing justice to the hard work that computational people do. But anyway, I'm optimistic that. Yeah. Yes?
One of the issues that you brought up in terms of the big list of potential issues was different firms have different elasticities, and maybe big firms have higher elasticities. For example, so you didn't delve into that too much. One, does that wind up being a problem? And two, is there some way to think about how we could detect whether different firms have different elasticities within your framework?
Fantastic. So take the basic GIV, just supply and demand in one market. So imagine you have two big firms, Apple and IBM, and lots of small firms, okay? And let's imagine, just to simplify the thought experiment, those small firms, they have the same, elasticity, okay? So you will use the small firms to get all the factor model right. This will extract from all those 1,000, say, small firms, the factors. Great. And then how do you estimate the elasticity of demand by Apple versus the one by IBM? So basically you would say, for Apple, you would use the idiosyncratic shock to IBM to look at how Apple reacts to that change in the price due to the IBM shock. So that's how you will estimate the elasticity of demand by Apple. And for the elasticity of demand by IBM, you will use the Apple shock to estimate the elasticity of demand by. And if you had 10 big firms, to look at firm number 3, you look at the idiosyncratic shocks of 9 other big firms to estimate the specific elasticity of firm number 3. That's how you would do. So there's a loop clearly, which is in professional parlance called a fixed point, but it works in principle. Yeah. Yes, I think you were next, and I think you were next. Yeah.
Thank you. you very much. So I wonder if you apply this method to a sectoral setting, then it has a network by itself. Then if you shock the network by itself, then it will have general equilibrium feedback. I wonder if you can capture that general equilibrium impact through that regional network itself.
Yeah, a priori, yes. I mean, again, part of the charm of reasoning this kind of abstract matrix way, well, lots of things you can put in the model, okay? And I used to, before in some cases, need to solve by hand what happens to those, if you have a model with n regions, what happens, etc. It's kind of fun, but a little tedious. And now, once you specify, here's the economic structure that gives a matrix of that shape, like the computer does calculates all the relevant loops for you. But still human thinking in between, because you specify a sensible model and an estimation strategy. The computer will do, okay, here's the loop and how this affects that, which affects that, and purify everything for you. Yeah. Yes?
So just to clarify, because I'm trying to understand the GIV. So is GIV more applicable to understand the effect of firm A on another firm B, or on the entire industry or market, instead of testing the change of firm A on firm A itself?
No, it's much more, it's really how firm A affects the aggregate market, or each individual firm, exactly, rather than on itself, absolutely. Yeah, that you cannot, no, you can only, again, it depends whether idiosyncratic shock, but you imagine idiosyncratic CEO, and then you replace the CEO, and you see how it affects.
Because I'm coming from a corporate governance perspective, and then the huge problem is endogeneity. And it's
right. No, it doesn't, that would not quite apply there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could imagine in a governance context, there was some scandal at firm B, okay, and as a result, some governance practice looks shady, and given that, firm A reacts. So that would be one way. This was an exogenous lower use of that practice by firm A because it was associated with some bad event, maybe idiosyncratic by firm B. That would be one way to do it, yeah.
Great. I think this kind of actually takes us dot on the spot there. So I think the last thing we need to do is just to give a big applause and thank you very much.